El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
Thank you very much for having me. It really is a pleasure to be here at this school. And I apologize that I'm not giving this presentation in French right now. And I'm grateful for your patience. But I hope in participating in this event, I'll be able to improve my French quite quickly. But I think we're meeting to discuss where the world is going at a very important period in world history. And the defining characteristic of this period is instability at all levels of society. Sudden and powerful shocks are emerging from the political, economic, military, diplomatic spheres, and also from the environment. And these are reacting forcefully back upon one another, which is making it impossible for the capitalist system to acquire any kind of lasting equilibrium. I think the first conclusion that we really have to absorb here is that we have entered the most turbulent period in human history. I know that might sound grandiose, but the interconnectedness of capitalism today and the depth of the crisis it is going through is demonstrating the truth of that statement. But what's also coming across clearly is the work of the ruling class and its representatives do not know what to do. They can only respond empirically, which is actually creating further crises and further horrors in the process. Now, for our part, we cannot afford to make this mistake. And discussing perspectives like this, it's essential for developing a deeper insight into the crisis being faced by humanity, to trace the development of class consciousness, and to orient ourselves for the struggle ahead. Now, fundamentally, what all of these crises that we're experiencing express is the historical dead end of the capitalist system. For the whole of human history, we see social systems arise and flourish and eventually disappear. Feudalism was one such system, capitalism is another. But no social system, however powerful, has ever lasted forever or will ever last forever. Marx explains that the reason for this is that the same social relations that had promoted the development of the productive forces, things like tools and technique, these relations actually turn into their opposites, and they become fetters holding back further course of human progress. Today, we're seeing precisely this process taking place, where the inherent contradictions of capitalism are holding back and degrading the enormously powerful productive forces that capitalism itself has created. The hoarding of wealth in private hands, the dismemberment of the world economy between small bourgeois nation states and national markets, the anarchy of the capitalist market, and the profit motive as the sole driving force of production. All of these things are inherent to capitalism. You cannot have capitalism without them, but they are in complete conflict with further economic and social development. Now, we don't reduce everything to economics as Marxists, but the roots of the present turmoil in politics and world relations can be traced to the fundamental economic crisis of capitalism. And in particular, the crisis that unfolded in 2007 to 2009, from which the capitalist system has not actually escaped, even to this day. The so-called Great Recession was the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression in the 30s. It was not simply the product of a financial crisis, as some have suggested. Rather, the financial crisis came about as a result of the accumulated contradictions of the system, which had been building up under the surface, and then came out into the open after the crash. Under capitalism, as I'm sure you know, the market is made up of various capitalist firms in competition with one another. In order to survive and thrive, each must strive to get a greater share of the market. And they do this by producing and selling as cheaply as possible. At the same time, they must maintain their profits by continually pressing down on the wages and conditions of the workers who produce all wealth. This means that on the one hand, the market is being flooded with commodities, while at the same time, the buying power of the working class, which makes up the overwhelming majority of the market, by the way, is constantly being restricted. Now, Marx and Engels pointed out way back in the Communist Manifesto that this contradiction periodically breaks out into what they call crises of overproduction. These are slumps in which businesses go bust, workers are thrown into unemployment, and a part of the productive forces must effectively be destroyed in order to make way for a new recovery. However, there are ways in which the capitalists can at least temporarily postpone these inevitable crises, especially today with the enormous power of finance capital, such as the banks and their links with the state. For example, the opening up of new markets can provide a boost. For example, after the opening up of the former USSR and China to the world market in the 1990s, which was referred to as globalization. Another important way of delaying the crisis is through the expansion of credit. Through credit, the market can be artificially extended beyond its natural limits. Workers can buy more products, businesses can invest in production. At the time, capitalist leaders even said that they had abolished boom and bust. But the problem is that debts eventually have to be repaid. And when it became clear that a lot of these debts would never be repaid in 2007, the banks at the heart of the world economy suddenly found that billions of dollars of their so-called assets were worthless. In truth, those assets never really existed. But the productive economy had actually become dependent on a lot of this fictitious wealth. And so in 12 months between 2008 and 2009, more than $2 trillion were wiped off the world economy, world GDP. Now, for decades, the economists and representatives of capital had been telling us, they've been saying, let the market decide. The state should not involve itself in the economy. But if the states had allowed these now bankrupt banks to fail and collapse, they would have dragged the whole world economy down with them, causing mass unemployment, enormous unrest, and even revolutions. These banks, therefore, they were too big to fail. So states bailed out the banks to the tune of trillions of dollars. They lowered interest rates to encourage more lending, and they carried out a policy of what was called quantitative easing, which was essentially printing money in order to stimulate the economy and prop up the capitalist system. But at the same time, the cost of this crisis and all of this bailout of the ruling class was passed directly onto the shoulders of the workers, with vicious austerity, a tax on wages, extension of the working day, full-scale class struggle waged by the ruling class. Meanwhile, the profits of the people who caused the crisis continued to rise. Even bourgeois journalists called it socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor. But an important point here is that this did not eliminate the overproduction in the economy. It was referred to as excess capacity. And as a result, the recovery that followed 2008 was the weakest in history. And actually, many economies were facing another recession in 2019, before the pandemic. Germany is an important example of this. But the pandemic and the lockdowns of 2020 were, of course, another important turning point in the situation. Trillions of dollars were handed out to businesses that would have had to close and workers who couldn't work. This huge injection of money to maintain demand, combined with restrictions to trade caused by the lockdowns, created an explosion of inflation. At the same time, you have this enormous accumulation of debt, by which I mean state debts, corporate debts, and household debts. And this debt has become an immense, weight, pressing down on the world economy. And both these factors, both enormous debts and high inflation, are expressions of the impasse of the system. And in order to combat inflation, central banks have been raising interest rates, which is starting to make this massive debt pile completely unsustainable. Poorer states are already going bankrupt. Sri Lanka, Zambia, Ghana, all of these are examples of this phenomenon. But the biggest economies in the world have piled up debts that cannot be repaid. The public debt of the United States of America now stands at $35 trillion. That is 100% of US GDP. And this debt is increasing by $1 trillion every 3 months. It's at its highest level since 1945, the end of the Second World War. And China is another very important example. After 2008, the Chinese state injected a huge amount of money into stimulating its own economy. And this was actually the main driver of global growth after 2008. But an important factor in the situation today is that China has now caught up with the crisis in the West. Total debt in China is now 300% of its GDP, over 300%. The economy, rather than inflation, the economy is actually facing the risk of deflation. But the government is held back from another big stimulus package because of these enormous debts. Because of these huge debt piles, which has already triggered a housing crisis. And in this context, we're seeing a fundamental shift in the world economy as a whole, from what I referred to previously as globalization to protectionism. States are putting up barriers to protect their own national markets, to protect jobs and their important national industries. Effectively, they're trying to export unemployment to other countries. And the most important example of this is the developing trade war between the United States and China. Trump placed high tariffs on some Chinese goods in his first term as president, but it's worth noting that Biden kept them in place. And this is because it was regarded as necessary by the whole US ruling class. Now Europe has placed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And what this means for our perspectives for the future is that these tariffs and this tendency towards protectionism will inevitably restrict world trade. Now, in the past, world GDP growth tended to follow growth in world trade. In the post-war boom, for instance, world trade expanded very rapidly. In the period of globalization that I referred to earlier, again, world trade expanded quite rapidly. Now it's all going into reverse. And this will make further slumps inevitable, further recessions inevitable. We should remember that it was protectionism and tariffs that pushed the world into the Great Depression after the 1929 crash. So what does this mean for society as a whole? Effectively, it means that the foundation of the world has cracked. And so not only in the economy, but in politics, in world relations, and actually in the psychology of the masses, we are seeing enormous changes taking place. We can see a parallel in geology. The tectonic plates of our society are shifting, causing earthquakes and eruptions everywhere. We are seeing a fundamental shift in world relations. The old liberal, so-called rules-based world order established after the Second World War is in a state of collapse. In fact, it has become impossible. This reflects an important perspective that we have to understand, which is the relative decline of US imperialism, which had been the main steward, the main guardian of this rules-based world order, because of course it was the #1 beneficiary of this world order. It was its order. Now, after the collapse of the USSR, US imperialism could effectively do what it liked. The liberal media at the time talked about a peace dividend. What that meant was, we don't have to spend money on weapons anymore, we can spend it on healthcare. Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history. He's writing very different articles now, by the way. I don't know if you've read any of them. But more importantly, while they were talking about peace, they intervened in the breakup of Yugoslavia. They bombed Serbia. They intervened in Africa, all over the region, backing different proxies in different countries, particularly in the Congo wars, which resulted in millions of deaths. And significantly, NATO expanded aggressively to the east to encircle Russia. But here we see that all things turn into their opposites eventually. After 9/11, I'm old enough to remember 9/11, and I remember straight afterwards the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, gave a speech in which he clearly expressed the worldview of US imperialism and its, what would you call it, ally? No, appendage, British imperialism. He said, "The kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux. Let us remake the world. Western imperialism believed that it could go into Afghanistan and Iraq and create liberal capitalist democracies under the domination of the West, of course. In fact, they were defeated in Iraq, they were defeated in Afghanistan, they were defeated in Syria, and each time to the benefit of smaller powers that previously had been unable to assert themselves in the same way. Iran, for example, has hugely expanded its influence in the Middle East, across Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. That was not the case in the past. Russia intervened directly in Syria and now has a firm ally there. Now, I should state that the United States remains the world's greatest military and economic superpower. That hasn't changed. But the key point here is that it's no longer able to impose its will as it did in the past. And it is being confronted by more dynamic rival imperialist powers. Now, any empire in decline is confronted by a very simple but very difficult question. What do we do? Do we pull up the drawbridge, if you know what I mean by that? Do we retreat, accept the loss of influence in certain areas, or do we push back? Both of these are right and both of these are wrong, actually. To constantly retreat will only accelerate decline, but if you push back, you risk actually encountering an even worse defeat. And we can see with French imperialism, British imperialism, that the ruling classes often alternate between both of these routes. I would say that we can see a similar process taking place in the United States. Under Trump, the United States retreated from a number of different places, for instance in Africa. China greatly expanded its influence, particularly economic influence in Africa, for example, and other places. But after President Biden was inaugurated, he gave a speech in February 2020, in which he said, "America is back." This was meant to inspire confidence in America's allies and terror in its enemies. In fact, we can see that this has accelerated the process of decline taking place. The US and its allies deliberately provoked the Russian invasion of Ukraine and deliberately scuppered a peace deal that was being discussed and signed in Istanbul in April of 2022. Why would they do this? They were quite open about this, not about deliberately provoking the war, but they were open that the idea was to weaken Russia. Russia would lose soldiers, lose missiles. They imposed very heavy economic sanctions which were intended to cripple the Russian economy. They wanted to turn Ukraine into another Afghanistan. You might remember the USSR invaded Afghanistan, it was a disaster. They wanted that to happen again in Ukraine. But as we can see, the war has actually achieved the opposite. The continued military support and funding by the West for Ukraine and the heavy sanctions placed on Russia, all these things have crystallized a dramatic change in world relations and diplomacy. And these changes were developing under the surface, but they've exploded to the fore now. What we see is that US allies have actually become less reliable. Well, unless you're talking about Europe, in which case they have deliberately undermined their own economy in order to maintain this bloc with the United States. Turkey hasn't done that. Turkey is a NATO member, and at the same time it's trading with Russia. And President Erdogan is openly boasting about how he can mediate between both sides. India is buying oil, cheap oil from Russia, which obviously is helping the Russian economy get around the sanctions. And then India is selling the same oil back to Europe at enhanced prices. I don't think that that was in the script. South Africa has held joint military exercises with Russia. This doesn't mean that South Africa has now become a firm ally of Russia or the BRICS. The point is that smaller powers now feel more room for maneuver to assert their own interests and balance between the different sides. Meanwhile, Russia, Iran, and China have been pushed closer together. We must remember that the BRICS is not a really tight alliance. These countries have, in some cases, very different interests. And capitalist Russia has not always been close with China. But now they have been forced into helping each other much more closely. And this is having an impact all over the world. The ongoing horror and slaughter in the Middle East is also part of this process. In 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran signed a deal mediated by China for the first time. These had been bitter enemies fighting a war with each other effectively in Yemen. In the same year, Benjamin Netanyahu boasted about a deal he was signing with Saudi Arabia and the surrounding Arab states, which would completely sell out the Palestinian people. You might remember at the UN he held up a map of the region where Israel comprised the whole of historic Palestine. Palestine had been erased on that map. And it is in that context that the 7th of October attacks occurred. And Israel's genocidal response has put pressure on all the Arab states to distance themselves from Israel and pull back from that deal. Now we have to remember this is not in the interests of US imperialism. And it reflects the inability of US imperialism to control the situation. And this is a change from the past. In the Suez crisis, when Britain and Israel went into Egypt in the 50s, the Americans said no, and it stopped immediately. During the first Intifada in the early 90s, Bill Clinton intervened directly and pushed Israel towards the Oslo Accords to stabilize the situation. Now they are hostage, not just to the Zionist Israeli state, but to even one man, Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is deeply unpopular inside Israel. The IDF, the Israeli army, is bogged down not only in Gaza but now in Lebanon. They cannot eradicate either Hamas or Hezbollah. In fact, the IDF are the most effective recruiting agents for Hamas and Hezbollah that you could ask for. In fact, Hezbollah gained the influence that it has in Lebanon precisely because of the atrocities of Israel and its puppets inside Lebanon. I think that the Israeli ruling class has realized that they cannot defeat Iran on their own. But Netanyahu needs this war to continue. The moment the war ends, he will be in trouble. And so he is openly trying to drag US imperialism into a direct conflict with Iran. And each time America, the USA and its allies, they complain, they call for instability, they call for stability, but then they allow themselves to be dragged deeper and deeper into the conflict. And fundamentally, this is because Israel is now the only solid ally of US imperialism in the entire region. And this process of destabilization is taking place all over the world. Some on the left have welcomed this under the name of multipolarity. The idea is that smaller states can gain greater independence and develop their economies more without the weight of US imperialism. They can balance between the different powers. But as much as I think we should welcome the decline of the old imperialist powers, we must recognize that the new period opening up is not one of stability and cooperation and development, but one of instability, war, and barbarism. I don't have time to go into these in detail, but look at Sudan, look at Eastern Congo. These conflicts are not simply being driven by the USA or Europe. Not only Russia and China, but also much smaller players are getting involved. For instance, the main backer of the Rapid Support Forces, one of the sides in the Sudanese civil war, is the United Arab Emirates. Rwanda and Uganda, which are hardly imperialist powers, each have several of their own proxies in Eastern Congo, some of which are fighting each other. In truth, none of the imperialist powers have control over the situation. And actually what we're starting to see is in some of the poorest countries, we're actually seeing total state collapse. Lenin explained 100 years ago that the continuation of capitalism is horror without end. That is the period being offered us by capitalism today. Now people have asked, is there going to be World War III? If that means a direct nuclear confrontation between the USA, Russia or China, I would have to say no. Although Biden is risking it, so I hope I'm not wrong. But both Putin and Biden know that the recent long-range missile strikes in Russia are not going to change the course of the war. Biden is simply trying to pull Trump further into the war that he's trying to get out of, and also improve the negotiating standpoint of Ukraine. But if I'm right and there isn't going to be World War III, does that mean we're going to have peace? Clearly not. What we are already seeing is the opening up of a whole period of proxy wars and civil wars all over the world. So if not a world war, then a world at war is already becoming a reality. And what we have to explain is the only way to end this situation is by the overthrow of the capitalist system that makes it inevitable. And in that context, we must also remember something very, very important. That in history, wars have often been accompanied by revolutions. Famously, the Russian Revolution took place in a period of war. The Paris Commune emerged out of the Franco-Prussian War. And when you look at the situation in the Middle East, you can see how terrified many of the reactionary Arab regimes are of the threat of revolution. The King of Jordan is hanging on by a thread. The rage of the masses, about more than just triggered by Palestine, but about also their conditions and the crisis faced in their lives. This rage is reaching boiling point. In Egypt, I think it's significant that in Egypt, the first demonstration to enter Tahrir Square since the revolution that overthrew Mubarak, it took place in the wake of the events in Palestine. It was provoked by Israel's attack on Gaza. This offers the key to the whole situation. The revolutionary movement of the Arab working class throughout the region, not just the Arab working class, but the working class throughout the region, is the only force capable of defeating and overthrowing Israeli imperialism and opening up a period of genuine peace and development for the Middle East. Lenin explained that the tasks of Marxists in war, in an imperialist war, is to strive to turn the war into a civil war, by which he meant a revolution of the working class against the capitalists. Today, we must base our perspectives on the inevitability of revolutionary movements everywhere, including in the advanced capitalist countries. And I want to talk briefly about Europe. The war in Ukraine has hugely intensified the deep, historic crisis of European capitalism. Even before the latest US elections, Europe was being crushed between tariffs from the United States, protectionist pressures from the United States, and competition from China. Cutting off access to Russian oil and gas has been a catastrophe for the European economy, particularly Germany. Now, the car industry, I read that the car industry in Europe employs about 14 million people across Europe. Some of the biggest and most important companies in Europe are car companies like Volkswagen. Until now, Volkswagen had never closed a plant in Germany. Now it's talking about closing 3 and talking about cutting workers' pay by 10%. In a period of inflation. The owner of Fiat is talking about closing one of its plants in Italy. Assembly lines, car plants in France are talking about moving their operations to other countries like Morocco. In this context, the EU has placed a 45% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles to try and protect its market. Interestingly, German capitalism was opposed to that tariff because, in fact, China is one of the most important markets for German exports. But even worse from the standpoint of the EU, China is moving electrical vehicle plants into Hungary. And the cars produced in Hungary will not be subject to the tariff. But this is actually threatening the integrity of the EU and the customs union and the single market. Because it's basically creating a front in the trade war within the single market itself. And the election of Trump now represents a catastrophe for European capitalism. Trump has made it clear that he intends for the European powers to shoulder the cost of continuing the war in Ukraine. And Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer have come up all brave, saying, yes, we'll do whatever it takes. But they are completely incapable of maintaining this. At the same time, Trump is talking about not only placing tariffs on Chinese goods, but on all imports, including from the European Union. The United States is the EU's most important export market. In short, the European capitalists are caught between a rock and a hard place. I think the Swiss paper has an article on the recent report by Mario Draghi. He calls for 800 billion euros, I think, in investment to develop the productive forces in Europe, to compete. And all of the European states said, yeah, fantastic. But who's going to pay it? The capitalists of Europe do have the money to pay, but they have absolutely no interest in investing in the European market. They're exporting their capital elsewhere. Wealthier member states like Germany and the Netherlands have made it quite clear they do not intend to increase the costs of their own debt to support European-wide investment. And so the answer that the leadership of the EU, the Commission always gives is, oh, we just need more European-wide debt, which is only, I don't know if you have this expression, kicking the can down the road, preparing for future problems. Another point that I took from Draghi's report is he doesn't put it as explicitly as I'm about to put it, but he says that Europe's monopolies are too small and not sufficiently monopolized to compete with the big American and Chinese monopolies. In America you have Tesla, in China you have BYD, and then in Europe each of the major European nations have their own monopoly that they proudly protect. So if you're going to further monopolize the European economy, who is going to lose out? Which is going to become the big European monopoly? Is it going to be Volkswagen? Is it going to be Renault? And this problem strikes right at the heart of the contradiction of the so-called European project under capitalism. The EU exists because of the need of the old European imperialist powers to club together, to defend their interests first against the USA and the USSR, later Japan, and now China as well. But it cannot overcome the different national interests of the member states, the bourgeois nation state. Further integration on a capitalist basis means some member states must lose out and some member states must gain. And this is leaving European capitalism in a state of paralysis. So far, the collective weakness of the European capitalist states has held the bloc together. But under the surface, the contradictions have been building up. And so it's no wonder that in this context, Eurosceptic parties are coming to the fore, even in Germany, the centre of the European economy. This all points to what Lenin said in 1915, when he was in Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? He said that the unification of Europe on a capitalist basis was a reactionary utopia. Only the overthrow of European capitalism and the unification of the region on a socialist basis, a socialist United States of Europe, can finally do away with the irrational division of the region between these old imperialist powers. But arguably more important than all of this is the question of what impact is this having on consciousness. All of the events and processes I've briefly talked about are raining down blows, striking the minds of people living in society today. Millions of people are desperately trying to find a way out of the crisis. And that is provoking huge swings to the right and to the left. And it's contributing to the general crisis of the bourgeois political regime all over the world. Now, it must be said that this has been developing for years. A major driving force has been austerity and the staggering inequality we see, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries. We saw it in the election of Syriza in Greece, with the Corbyn movement in Britain, but also with the Brexit vote in Britain and the success of Boris Johnson. What all of these different phenomena are expressing is a huge rage accumulating at the base of society. A hatred, and a class hatred, actually, directed at the whole capitalist establishment. Directed not only at the capitalists themselves, like the bankers, not only at all politicians who are considered corrupt, not only at the church. The Church of England is going through yet another crisis as I speak. Not that that's the most important point of perspectives, but just to let you know. And also the so-called free press, that other pillar of the capitalist establishment. And it's this anger that produced the election and the re-election, importantly, of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is like the personification of this crisis of bourgeois democracy. And one thing that's striking about the recent election in the United States was that Kamala Harris's campaign was all about how great everything was going. You might remember Trump's famous slogan, "Make America Great Again." Hillary Clinton, her response to that was, "America is already great." And Kamala Harris, her campaign was all based on joy. The economy is doing great. Biden has successfully reduced inflation. But Trump, and not just Trump, but his other people in his campaign, like J.D. Vance, they talked explicitly about American decline, both abroad and at home. They talked about the working class. Now, that might not be as seem as profound in Europe, where even right-wing politicians sometimes talk about the working class. I've been following American politics since about 2008. The first American politician I have ever heard use the words working and class together was Donald Trump. That's amazing, isn't it? Bernie Sanders didn't even say working class. Left-wing politicians in America talked about the working middle class. Why? Because everybody is middle class in the United States. That's the idea. Everyone is a frustrated billionaire just waiting to make it. And left-wing people in Europe have often complained to me about, the American workers, they've been bourgeoisified. They think they are just billionaires waiting to make it. By the way, left-wing academics said the same thing about the French proletariat before 1968. But that's a whole other topic I won't go into. The point is, yes, that is the ideology that the American ruling class has tried to foist upon the workers for decades, but that is no longer the reality, if it ever was the truth. And Donald Trump has done something very dangerous from the standpoint of American capitalism. He cut through that mystification, that myth, and he talked directly to American workers about the conditions of life, about inflation. Now, obviously, he did this in a demagogic way, in a pretty dishonest way. He's a right-winger, a billionaire, a capitalist, but he has actually capitalized, shall we say, on a very real rage and a very real mood that exists in American society, in the working class, not just in kind of the more petty bourgeois right-wing base that he had previously. So what happened on election day? In the end, Trump has gained about 2.5 million votes. That on its own is not that much, but he increased his proportion of the vote in every single demographic, including amongst black voters in the United States. But he won the popular vote, which nobody expected him to do. I thought Trump would win, but I did not think he would win the popular vote. And a big part of why he won the popular vote was because the Democrats lost 7 million votes. Their whole message of, aren't things going well, vote for us to preserve the status quo, went down very badly, I'll put it that way. Inequality has increased constantly since 2008. Deaths of despair, meaning things like suicides or drug overdoses, have increased a lot in this period. US life expectancy has gone down by 3 years in the most powerful economy in the world. And 63% of people said that they were not represented by either of the two major parties. And actually, more people are now registered as independents, so neither Republican or Democrat, than registered voters of either of those parties. You don't see that on the surface of American politics because it's just always the two parties arguing with each other. But it is beginning to express itself. This might sound odd, but Trump's election and Trump's success does actually represent, in many ways, a movement against both parties. Yes, he was a Republican candidate, but he became the Republican candidate against the opposition of the entire Republican establishment, all of the traditional Republicans. And his supporters often describe themselves as supporters of Trump, not of the Republicans. And this, Trump himself, as I said, is a reactionary demagogue and a defender of capitalism. But the rage of working class voters who have backed him, at least for now, that does actually have progressive implications. We don't need to defend Trump to recognize that fact. Perhaps a more important question is, why has it expressed itself through Trump? Why has that rage expressed itself through Trump? And the answer to that question is the complete failure and capitulation of the so-called left, the left leaders. Bernie Sanders could have offered a way out. He had huge support, particularly amongst young people and amongst working class voters. He called for a revolution against the billionaire class. That was his famous slogan. But then what did he do? He capitulated to the Democratic establishment, as in the establishment of the Democratic Party. He endorsed Hillary Clinton. He endorsed Joe Biden. He endorsed Kamala Harris. So Trump then comes along, and effectively, he offers his own kind of political revolution against the billionaire class, carried out by another part of the billionaire class. It's worth pointing out that the majority of America's billionaires supported Harris in this election. But Trump is actually bringing American billionaires into his government, the mavericks, you know, the outsiders. Elon Musk, he's a billionaire, of course, very famous billionaire. Vivek Ramaswamy, who is also in this Department of Government Efficiency with Musk, he's another billionaire. Howard Lutnick is his trade secretary, who is a billionaire investment banker. Now, there's an important point in all this, that the most powerful ruling class on the planet is split. And one thing, I don't know if you've been following Trump's appointments to his administration. All of these people have quite a lot of crazy ideas, often very different and in conflict with one another. But one thing that is very consistent is all of them are saying explicitly they want to carry out a purge of the state apparatus. This is the most powerful state bureaucracy in the world, the most powerful military in the world. And the defense secretary got his job, apparently, because in a meeting, he said, and forgive my language, I'm going to go in there and start cutting fucking heads. By in there, he meant into the Pentagon. He's setting up what's something called a warrior council, which sounds like something from the Klingon Empire, the purpose of which is to identify and sack woke generals. I don't have time to go into more detail, so I'll focus on what is the main point here. That the ruling class is split and an open conflict within the state apparatus is taking place not under the surface, not in secret, but before the eyes of millions of workers around the world. And that has enormous significance for the class struggle. Lenin actually explained that the ruling class being split and unable to rule how it did in the past is the first condition for a successful revolution. But the first condition is not everything that's required for a revolution. But in addition to this, we are seeing and one point that I don't have time to go into it, but we are seeing a similar process all over the world. In Europe, for instance, the collapse of the coalition government in Germany and the increasing support for Alternative for Deutschland. The election of the Brothers of Italy, in Giorgia Meloni. Now, an important point here is the Brothers of Italy became the largest party in Italy, not because the majority of Italians have become far right or fascist, but because the Brothers of Italy was the only party in the whole Italian parliament that did not take part in Draghi's coalition government. They were, in effect, the only opposition party. Now, Macron is paving the way for more successes for the, what's it called, Rassemblement National. And sometimes I hear people on the left despairing. Everything is a shift to the right. The workers are all moving right. I'd say that that is a superficial approach to the question. The rage building up in society is palpable. You can see it and you can hear it at bus stops or in pubs, wherever. Amongst the youth in particular, openly communist ideas are becoming more popular than certainly any time in my lifetime. There is a burning hatred directed towards the whole of the ruling class and its establishment. And this has been intensified and focused by the genocidal war in Gaza. Is this a shift to the right or to the left? I would say this represents a shift to the left, but it is not being expressed on the surface of mainstream politics. But it will find an expression. Just like magma building up beneath the Earth's surface will find a way out through volcanic eruptions. Already we've seen revolutionary movements in places like Sri Lanka, in Kenya. We have seen mass movements of the working class in other countries like Europe, like the movement against the pension so-called reform in France. But the point is, every time these movements have been held back by their own leadership. And as a result, to sum up, we are living in a period of revolution and counter-revolution on a world scale. And the title of this session asks the question, où va le monde? And when I think about the period opening up in front of us, I'm reminded of some of the words of the Internationale. Le monde va changer de base. This is not going to be a short, easy process. But there will be successes and there will be defeats. But the tide of history is turning in our direction. I want to touch brief on what is our role in this situation. Trotsky, in 1938, Trotsky said the following about the international that he founded, the Fourth International. The central task of the Fourth International consists in freeing the proletariat from the old leadership, whose conservatism is in complete contradiction to the catastrophic eruptions of disintegrating capitalism, and represents the chief obstacle to historical progress. That is the task we have set ourselves in the Revolutionary Communist International. But are we actually able to do this right now? Can we replace the old, insufficient leadership of the working class right now? Unfortunately, we cannot. We are too small. We lack deep roots in the working class. We can, and I believe we will, become a pole of attraction in the huge events that are coming in the class struggle. But first we must have a clear, scientific perspective of where the class struggle is heading, and we must build up our forces on that basis. We must weld together a solid cadre, a core of disciplined, resolute, but above all trained Marxists. And in this process, theory and education are absolutely essential. But at the same time, we must find a way to open a dialogue with wider layers of workers and youth beyond our ranks. We should not be afraid to be bold and stand out. But we also need to be able to listen to the workers, to gauge, to evaluate the mood, to use our slogans and campaigns to attract the best, most militant layers of workers and youth. And then to be able to explain our ideas, to convince these people to devote their lives to the revolutionary struggle, and then educate them in the methods of Marxism so they can go off and do exactly the same thing. That's what a cadre is. This is not necessarily easy, and it's not quick either, but we should have confidence. We are bringing together an international full of revolutionary optimism and a desire to fight. But above all, we have the ideas and methods of Marxism. If we steel ourselves in these ideas, if we build a strong organization of thousands of Marxist cadres all over the world, then we will be able to intervene in the momentous events that lie ahead and build a revolutionary party that will change the course of history.